Soft layers of sponge cake soaked with limoncello or lemonade and filled with a light heavenly custard. It's an iconic Italian lemon cake, the Torta Mimosa.
Hi there, I'm Nicole with Piatto Recipes. Today we'll be making a mimosa cake. This cake gets its name from the way it's decorated. Tiny pieces of fluffy sponge cake are applied to the outside of the cake in order to resemble mimosa flowers which bloom in early spring. And here we have an example of the mimosa flowers here. This simple cake has 3 parts: soft sponge cake, a light creamy custard, and sweet liquor to soak the layers of sponge cake. For non-alcoholic variations on this cake, you can use lemonade to soak the layers of cake or even pineapple juice. Here I'm using Italian limoncello, which is a traditional choice. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe for free to the Piatto Recipes channel and click the bell for new video notifications. Let's start with a sponge cake, called Pan di Spagna in Italian. This recipe makes 2 sheet cakes, which will give us 3 round layers of cake and plenty of extra to create our pretend mimosa flowers to decorate the outside. To make the first Pan di Spagna, we add 6 whole cold eggs to a large bowl. To that, we add granulated sugar and the zest from 1 lemon. This cake is easy but requires a lot of whipping, so it's best to use a stand mixer if you've got one. Here I'm using a KitchenAid Heavy Duty, which is similar to the KitchenAid Pro series sold in the US. The biggest mistake people make when whipping eggs is whipping eggs that aren't warm enough. Leaving them out at room temperature gives too much room for error. So here we are just using cold eggs and simply adding 3 tablespoons of hot water right after we start whipping the eggs. This will give us the perfect temperature for whipping. Now I'm whipping the eggs at medium speed, a 6 on my stand mixer, and I'm setting the timer for 15 minutes. At this point, you can sift the flour, have a cup of coffee, whatever you need to do to avoid stopping the stand mixer too early. It really does require about 15 minutes to whip these eggs to the right consistency. We are looking for super pale, fluffy eggs. When we flick our eggs, they should hold their shape and sit on top of the rest of the egg mix. We're not there yet. And there we have it. While the eggs are whipping, I'm sifting together cornstarch and flour. Time to fold in the flour. Sift about a tablespoon of flour mix at a time into the eggs. Never sift in too much flour at once. The result will be a clumpy, uneven batter. Here's a little tip. If the whipped eggs start to sink under the weight of the flour, you are adding too much. When folding in the flour, I always give it a couple of shallow stirs and then begin to fold the flour in gently with a bottom to top motion like this, occasionally cutting the egg down the middle with my spatula to help better incorporate the flour. When all of the flour has been folded into the eggs, we move on to spreading the batter into the pan. Here I'm using a 15 by 12 inch or a 40 centimeter by 30 centimeter pan lined with parchment paper. You'll want to use a similar size pan if you want to make the same size cake that I'm making here. Now I'm spreading the batter evenly in the pan. I'm making 1 sheet cake at a time because I prefer to bake 1 at a time in the lower third of the oven. This ensures an even baking and lets me get the batter into the oven quickly to avoid any egg deflation. The Pan di Spagna originated during the Renaissance. In that recipe, only egg was used for leavening, just as we are doing in this recipe. But whipped eggs are sensitive to temperature changes, so we want to avoid opening the oven during the bake. So it's not possible in this case to swap 2 cakes halfway through the cook time for an even bake as we might do for another recipe. So it's one at a time. I'm baking the sponge cake in a preheated 350-degree static oven for 15 minutes. The most common problem people have with sponge cakes, aside from whipping the eggs and folding in the flour, is the problem of deflation. Sometimes they produce a beautiful sponge cake, and then when they take it out of the oven, it deflates way too much and the sides become deformed. So here are my top tips for avoiding that catastrophe. Do line the bottom of your cake pan or other kind of pan with parchment paper when making a sponge cake, but do not line the sides, because as the sponge cake cools, it will pull in on the parchment paper, deforming the sides of your sponge cake. Also, when your cake is finished baking, turn off the oven and leave the cake in the oven for about 5 minutes to cool down slowly, leaving the door cracked if possible. This lets the cake cool slowly to minimize deflation. Another tip to avoid your sponge cake deflating too much as it cools is to simply leave it in the pan attached to the side to cool completely before removing it from your pan. For the torta mimosa, we want 4 layers of cake altogether plus a little bit extra. 3 layers for the cake itself, and 1 plus some extra to cut up into those beautiful mimosa-like flower shapes. Now I'm choosing to use a cake ring that I have at home, but to cut up this cake into the right form, you could also choose to use a plate, basically any kind of pattern that you can trace around. Just be sure that you can cut out at least 4 slices of cake altogether. And the sponge cake is actually really easy to cut with a knife, or you can always cut with scissors. And now I'm going to make a second 6-egg pan di Spagna in the exact same way. Now I'm cutting all of the cake scraps into tiny cubes for the outside of the cake, about 1/4 inch or 1/2 centimeter in size. This size will give you the best looking decoration and most resemble the mimosa flowers. Be sure to remove any brown sides from the pan di Spagna to get an even colored decoration. And now it's time to make our custard. Here we'll be making a Diplomat cream. There are many types of custards in the world of pastries, and a Diplomat cream is a mix of 2 of the most popular, a pastry cream, sometimes called a creme pat, and a Chantilly cream. If you don't know how to make either of these creams, fasten your seatbelts because by the end of this video, you'll be an expert at making them both. Let's get started. Let's start with the pastry cream, sometimes called creme pat. I've put a large bowl into the freezer about an hour before starting my custard. We'll need it to cool the finished custard. Start by zesting 1 whole lemon and setting it aside. Then in a large bowl, I combine sugar, cornstarch, flour, and 10 egg yolks. Always separate eggs cold for a clean separation. And with the whites, you can make a meringue or even an angel food cake. Many people don't know it, but previously frozen egg whites whip wonderfully. To a medium saucepan, I'm adding 2 cups or about 500 milliliters of milk and the seeds and pieces from 1 vanilla bean. I'm warming the milk until it is vigorously simmering but not boiling. While the milk is warming, I'm simply whisking the egg mixture to a smooth, thick paste. When the milk is hot, remove the vanilla bean pieces. Then add all of the hot milk a little at a time to the eggs, whisking vigorously. This is called tempering the eggs. It means that we're simply warming the eggs to the temperature of the milk. At this point, I always strain the liquid as I'm pouring it back into the saucepan. This removes any clumps that might remain after the mixing. After all, we want the silkiest cream possible for our cake. And now add the lemon zest. Then cook the custard over medium heat, whisking continuously. When the custard has thickened, it's time to transfer it to that icy cold bowl and continue whisking. This time, we're whisking to quickly drop the temperature of the custard. This will produce the creamiest custard possible. When the custard is cooled, I'm just going to cover it and pop it into the refrigerator while I make the rest of my ingredients. Lay the plastic wrap directly on top of the custard and not on top of the bowl. Even the smallest amount of air between the custard and the top of the bowl can create a skin on the custard, and we don't want that. Now let's make the Chantilly cream. Now that our pastry cream is made and chilling in the refrigerator, let's move on to the Chantilly cream. To make a Chantilly cream, we just need 3 ingredients: cold heavy whipping cream, a bit of fresh vanilla, and some powdered sugar. The ideal fresh vanilla bean is between 6 and 7 inches or 16 to 18 centimeters. And in fact, mine is the ideal size. For the Chantilly cream, I'll be using 1/4 of this vanilla bean. To make the Chantilly cream, start with a cold bowl. You can even put the bowl in the freezer for half an hour before you plan to whip up the Chantilly cream. We're going to whip this cream about halfway to the final consistency before adding any sugar at all. And as for the sugar, to make Chantilly cream, we want the weight of the sugar to be 14% the weight of the heavy cream. And so for our recipe, that's 30 grams. The trick to determining if you've whipped your heavy cream enough for Chantilly cream, in other words, if it's stiff enough, is to flip the bowl over. If nothing comes out, you're good to go. Specifically, a Diplomat cream is 2/3 part pastry cream and 1/3 part Chantilly cream. And now we're going to fold our heavy whipping cream, our Chantilly cream, into the pastry cream a little at a time. Using the same motion that we used to integrate the flour into our whipped eggs when we made the sponge cake. Now I'm going to fill my pastry bag with this beautiful Diplomat cream. Here I'm using a silicone pastry bag, which is easy to clean and easy to use. And I don't need to add any special decorative tip because I'm simply using this in order to make it easier to pipe the cream onto our cake. Sometimes people find filling a pastry bag to be a messy job. So the easiest way to avoid mess is to fold the top of the pastry bag down about halfway. That gives us easier access to the bottom or center of the bag. It makes it more efficient to fill the bag in a clean way. Oh my God, it looks so delicious. So as you can see, we have about 1/4 of the Diplomat cream remaining. And I'm gonna use that to cover the top of our cake with a little extra left over to spread along the sides in order to help our beautiful fluffy pieces of sponge cake stick to the outside. I'm just gonna use this little tool that comes with most pastry bags to gently push the cream a little bit farther into the bottom of the bag. Finally, it's time to assemble, and we'll start by soaking the first layer of sponge cake with fresh limoncello. For non-alcoholic variations on this cake, You can use lemonade to soak the layers of cake, or even pineapple juice. In fact, in many variations, pineapple juice is used to soak the sponge cake, and tiny pieces of fresh pineapple are added to the crema. And then we pipe on a layer of that Diplomat cream. It's just fine if the cream seems a little bit liquidy, because once this cake sets in the refrigerator, it will firm up considerably. So in the end, I've ended up using about 100 milliliters, or a little over 3 ounces of limoncello. If your sides don't look perfect, it really doesn't matter. In fact, this is a very forgiving cake because at the end of all this, we're going to be covering the entire outside with fluffy little pieces of sponge cake. Here I'm using a spatula to create a dome-like effect on the top. And we want to make sure that the entire sides and top of the cake is well covered in cream. So we're not worrying about making it look really pretty because this isn't that kind of cake. We're going to be covering the outside with decoration. Fluffy, fluffy! This is such a pretty decoration that is really difficult to mess up. You'll simply get better coverage if you use really tiny pieces of sponge cake to cover the outside. I always like to make a first coat, a first rough coat, and then I can place little cubes of sponge cake in any bits of white Diplomat cream that are still poking out. And here we have our final Torta Mimosa. Bellissima! Time for a look inside and a little taste.